Built into us.
So the goal for today is to try to conclude this series in a way that will also summarize some of the feelings and thoughts that we've discussed. We'll see if we can do that, and I'll just again to share some of the personal background to this particular shiur. I've mentioned a few times that my father-in-law passed away fairly suddenly a few years ago over Sukkot, and it was the kind of thing that it took a long time to incorporate that reality into our daily existence. And the second summer after he passed away, like after the full year was up, I actually studied the laws of AVEILUT, and in studying the laws of AVEILUT again, I picked up on a particular strange element that emerges in a number of rabbinic sources on AVEILUT. And in thinking about it and learning that and analyzing it, it kind of finally gave me personally, and I think Sherry too, a small sense of affirmation and comfort and consolation. So this class is really an outgrowth of the research, both Torah and academic, that I did in memory of my father-in-law, David ben Elazar Yoshua. So I hope that it's a reflection of his personality. He was curious about all kinds of knowledge, and he appreciated, in particular, high-level Torah study. And it's also a snapshot in time of kind of where we were at religiously, emotionally, and psychologically 2 years after his sudden illness and passing. So I'm hopeful that for those who've experienced the loss at whatever stage, whether in the year or perhaps reflecting back, that some of the insights today will be meaningful. Hopefully in the same way that Kaddish, we tried to add and broaden our understanding of what Kaddish is about. This will hopefully give us a little bit more of a sense of what Chazal were driving at with some of the laws of mourning.
I would just like to say that I appreciate it, particularly this week, because I have a 11th yard site from my mother this week, Thursday night, $11 in the Omer. Said she waited until the Omer was over.
Right.
And so you tend to be
okay. So we'll learn in her memory as well.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm calling this class Anticipatory AVEILUT. And we'll talk about what that means in a moment. Typically, again, before relearning some of these sugyas from a Jewish perspective, from a halachic perspective, the notion of anticipatory mourning seems foreign. The letter and spirit of Jewish law generally require complete commitment to the sanctity of life. And any form of advanced mourning is either unseemly at best and maybe halachically problematic at worst. And this comes up sometimes, a lot of times when there's a terminal illness or someone who's quite elderly. As a rabbi, I get a lot of questions, in advance, and sometimes they're questions that are important to deal with, like knowing where the person who is very ill wants to be buried. Like that's important. But sometimes they're so detailed and so focused on post passing, then I'll encourage the family to kind of take advantage of the moments, even if it's the last moments, to spend the time with the loved one and to think about ways in which you can kind of complete the journey in meaningful ways. And that's kind of, I would say, the impulse that I always had. And like I said, we're going to see that a deeper encounter with traditional rabbinic sources related to AVEILUT reveals a stunning notion of anticipatory AVEILUT. And we'll see that it even surfaces within the normative framework of conventional AVEILUT, and I hope to trace that concept in its contours in biblical, rabbinic, and later halachic sources and really get into it. This notion of anticipatory AVEILUT I'm borrowing from a term that was made fairly well known in psychological fields, in the mental health field, by a psychologist named Eric Lindemann. And I subtitled it An Exploration of Rabbinic Thanatology. Just a word on what that. Thanatology is the scientific study of death and the practices associated with it, including the needs of the terminally ill and their families. And this has become a real field and a complex subfield, anticipatory grief versus mourning. One recent volume that I read on anticipatory mourning describes it as, quote, the phenomenon encompassing the processes of mourning, coping, interaction, planning, and psychosocial reorganization that are stimulated and begin in part due to the awareness of the impending loss of a loved one and the recognition of associated loss in the past, present, and future. It is seldom explicitly recognized, but the truly therapeutic experience of anticipatory grief mandates a delicate balance among the mutually conflicting demands of simultaneously holding on to, letting go of, and drawing closer to the patient. This field really began, the field of thanatology, not rabbinic thanatology, that's the field I'm making up. But the field of thanatology, Freud had alluded to it, but the most famous study is a study by Lindemann in 1944 dealing with wartime separation of spouses.
When was Kubler-Ross? When did she write?
In the 60s,
In the 60s,
Yeah.
she's after.
Right. And yes, certainly with children, we're going to see children dealing with terminal illness and the like. This is a very important field. So this study, it's remarkable. We'll just take a look at it. While our studies were first limited to reactions to actual death, it must be understood that grief reactions are just one form of separation reactions. Separation by death is characterized by its irreversibility and finality. Separation may, of course, occur for other reasons. We were at first surprised to find genuine grief reactions in patients who had not experienced a bereavement, but who had experienced separation. For instance, with the departure of a member of the family into the armed forces. Separation in this case is not due to death, but is under the threat of death. A common picture, hitherto not appreciated, is a syndrome which we have designated anticipatory grief. He really coined this phrase. The patient is so concerned with her adjustment after the potential death of father or son or spouse that she goes through all the phases of grief: depression, heightened preoccupation with departing, a review of all the forms of death which might befall, and anticipation of the modes of readjustment which might be necessitated by it. While this reaction may well form a safeguard against the impact of a sudden death, notice, it's a coping mechanism, it can turn out to be of a disadvantage at the occasion of reunion. Several instances of this sort came to our attention when a soldier just returned from the battlefront complained that his wife did not love him anymore and demanded immediate divorce. In such situations, apparently the grief work had been done so effectively that the patient has emancipated herself, and the readjustment must now be directed towards new interaction. It is important to know this because many family disasters of this sort may be avoided through prophylactic measures. So it's a remarkable observation that during World War II, the husbands would come home and their wives had so thoroughly anticipated the grief that the reabsorption or readjustment to life together. Again, there may be other factors. There might be post-traumatic. Now we're so much more attuned to the horrors and everything else, and that's the veterans. But the in this case, it would seem that the pathology was on the side of those who were left home.
Post-traumatic stress
Right.
disorder.
But it's very interesting that after the Vietnam War and they had the prisoners, and I remember when the prisoners were released, and I was a history teacher, so I read up on all of this, that very shortly afterwards there was a lot of divorce. McCain himself, who was a prisoner of war, when he came home, I don't know what the problems were, divorced his wife. So this is ongoing in every situation that we have.
So again, this is now
But thinking
a
about
long time ago.
1944 is a revolutionary concept.
Right. And in that context, they were focused more on the anticipatory grief of the people who remained behind, and not necessarily on the challenges that the veterans returning to civilian life had. So when I started learning about this, it occurred to me, so it's important, and it is very important for caregivers, for rabbis, for mental health professionals, for others, to help people, especially in cases of terminal illness, kind of navigate this in a meaningful way. But I didn't really think this had much bearing. It pastorally is important, but it's not something which halachically has much relevance. And then, I still remember I was in the Beit Midrash here, learning the third parak of Moed Katan, and I came across this Gemara, and it struck me as really, really strange. So let's take a look at source number 2, where we'll see kind of where the Jewish notion of anticipatory AVEILUT may be relevant, and not just relevant in some extraordinary circumstance and exceptional cases, but even in, like I said, the normative framework of conventional AVEILUT. The Gemara in Moed Katan, in the third parak, identifies a number of biblical passages that support the mourning rituals. One of the less obvious source texts that the Gemara cites in this context is from Shmuel Bet, the concluding chapter of the David and Bathsheba story. So let's take a look at source number 2. Avel asur b'tashmish amita. A mourner during the week of Shiva is forbidden to have sexual relations. Dichtiv, vayinachem David et Bathsheba ishto, vayavo eleha. Then David consoled his wife Bathsheba. Importantly, that's the first time Bathsheba is referred to as David's wife as opposed to Eshet Uriah. That this is the moment after the death of the child. We'll go over the story in a minute, where the bond between David and Bathsheba now moves from a sexual bond to a bond of husband and wife. And the Gemara uses this verse, Michlal d'mi ikara aser, to imply that before David had comforted Bathsheba and had intercourse with her, vayavo eleha, prior to that it was forbidden. And so we derive, according to this Gemara, let's just state it clearly, we learn out the prohibition of sexual relations for a mourner from the story of David and Bathsheba and the fact that they apparently weren't together, didn't cohabit for a period of time, and then resumed, or now I guess, resumed their sexual lives following a period of mourning. Here's what's very strange about this. If you read the chapter in Shmuel, which I have here, it sounds like David deliberately defies the normal mourning laws. Right, let's go over the story. David sees Bathsheba in Perek Aleph. David takes Bathsheba. David sleeps with Bathsheba. Bathsheba conceives. David tries to figure out a way to get Uriah to come home to have relations with Bathsheba so that it won't be obvious that this is David's child. Uriah refuses to do so for whatever reason. Eventually, David sends him back to battle with a note telling Yoav, make sure you put him on the front and make sure that he dies. Yoav does the job all too well and has a bunch of other soldiers killed along with him. And David seemingly is going to get away with it. Then Natan HaNavi comes to David, tells him the parable, very powerful story of the rich man and the poor man, and David thinks, that in the story, he identifies with the poor man. Why he identifies with the poor man is a different story. He still sees himself. He has trauma from what Shaul has done to him, it would seem. And finally, Natan says, no, you're the one who's done wrong here, and you're the one who's going to have to pay the price. And because you acknowledged your sin right away, David says right away, chatati, which is remarkable. You're going to be okay. Your crown is going. Your family is going to keep the monarchy. You're going to be the dynastic king. But this child's going to die. Okay. David moves into a mode of when the child's born, of doing everything he can to save the child. So we'll pick up with that in source number 3. Vayomer David el Natan chatati laHashem. Vayomer Natan el David gam Hashem havir chatatcha lo tamut. If you want to follow along in the English, it's on the next page. Efes ki niyetz niyatzet vayvei Hashem advar hazeh gam ben hayilod lecha mot yamut. Your kid's going to die, but you're going to be okay. Vayelech Natan el beito. Natan goes home. Vayigof Hashem et hayelad asher yolda eshet Uriah leDavid vayeyanesh. Right? She's eshet Uriah still here. She is described as the wife of Uriah, and the child becomes very sick. So listen to what David does. Vayivakesh David et Elohim ba'ad hanar. David seeks out God, beseeches God on behalf of the child and the health of the child. Vayatzam David som. David fasts uva v'lan v'shachav arza, and he sits and lies on the ground. Vayakumu ziknei beito alav lahakimo min arz. And the elders of the palace court try to get David to get up. It's not befitting a king to sit on the floor and to lie down and to act like this. V'lo ava, v'lo vara itam lechem. He won't eat with them. He won't listen to them. Vayihi bayom hashvi'i. And it was on the 7th day of this period. Vayamat hayeled. The baby dies. Not on the child's 7th day. It's not clear if the child got sick right away. The 7th day from when the child got sick and David started the fasting and mourning practices. Vayiru avdei David lahagid lo kimei tayel. The servants of David are afraid to tell him. Ki amru, they said to themselves, Hinei biyot hayeled chai dibarnu elav lo shema b'kolei. When the kid was alive, he was acting like a complete crazy person. Now, if we tell him, if we tell him that the kid's actually dead, well, who knows what he's capable of? Now, David sees that the servants are avoiding him. Yeah. Vayavin David, and David understood and knew. And they say yes, the child has died. Vayakam David meha'aretz. David gets up off the ground. Vayirchatz vayasach. And he washes himself and he anoints himself. What are these practices? These are practices that you do after you've mourned. Vayechalef simlotav. He changes his garments. Vayavo beit Hashem. And he goes to the Mishkan. Vayishtachu. Vayavo el beito. Vayishal vayasimu lo lechem vayochal. And he sits down and he has a meal, feasting. Vayamru avadav elav, and the servants now are perplexed. Ma davar hazeh asher hasita. Ba'avor hayeled chai samta v'tev. When the kid was sick, you cried and you called out to God and you fasted. And now the kasher meita yeled kamta v'tocha lachem. Now you get up and you act like everything's great. Vayomer, and David explains, Ba'od hayeled chai samti v'avkeh ki amarti ni yodea v'chanani Hashem v'chai hayeled. When the kid was sick, I thought maybe I can do something to avert the verdict. Va'ata mate. Now that the kid has died, lama zanitzam ha'uchal hashivo. Can I bring him back? Od ani holech elav hu lo yashuv elai. If I keep on trying to bring him back, he's not coming back to me. And then we read our pasuk. Vayinachem David et Batsheva ishto vayavo elaha. David comforts, consoles his wife Batsheva, and he has sexual relations with her. Vayishkavima vatelid bein vatikrat shmo Shlomo v'Hashem ahivo. This is the story of the birth of Shlomo, the person who eventually succeeds David, is in the aftermath of this horrific tragedy. And so this is a really important moment in Tanakh, but I want to go back to how the Gemara seems to be understanding this moment. The Gemara says that this moment is the source from which we derive that an Avel during Shiva is not permitted to have sexual relations. But let me ask you a question. Did David ever sit Shiva?
No.
No,
because he did it before.
Right. So we're going to get to that in a second. David's actions before the child dies mirror the laws of Shiva. They're not exactly the same because he's fasting. There's an element of beseeching God that doesn't totally map onto what we do. But sitting on the floor and wearing special garments, which it's clear did, right, and not changing his clothing, seems to suggest that there's some kind of mourning going on. And the other key phrase is Vayhi bayom hashvi'i, on the seventh day, and in this case the child dies on the seventh day, which ends the mourning. So the questions that we have to ask are, how is this case, a case where David actually doesn't sit Shiva, the source for us when we do sit Shiva? And if you want to say like what we just said, which is a big chiddush, that the practices that David did before the child passed away somehow qualify as mourning practices, that wasn't David's intention. David, when he was doing those things, was not mourning, he was praying, petitioning, trying to do whatever he could to change the fate that he's been told is unavoidable.
Were there dinim? Were there been hugging yet of AVEILUT?
So again, what AVEILUT looks like in Tanakh is a really good question. We definitely have some kind of letting the hair grow and some kind of tearing certain garments. You have Mordechai, Vayilbash Sak Ve'efer. You have some proto-mourning practices. But yes, this is the rabbis trying their best to read back into these stories halachic practices that by the time of the Gemara had become more established. So it's not literally that they observed all the mourning practices that we have, but it's finding in the stories in Tanakh examples of or models for our mourning practice. Now what's so interesting about this particular model is David didn't mourn. He didn't sit Shiva. And a lot of cases in the Bible from which we derive mourning practices, we're going to see, are cases where people don't mourn. One of the biggest proof texts, or one of the richest sources in Tanakh for the laws of mourning, is what Aaron and his sons are told not to do after Nadav and Avihu died. Don't stop what you're doing. Don't do X, Y, and Z, continue to eat the korbanot. From that we derive what you're typically supposed to do. So it's an interesting phenomenon that a lot of our morning practices are learned from cases in Tanakh where biblical figures are instructed not to do certain things, which nichlal lav atashomei Hain, from the fact that these were exceptional cases, we derive what you're supposed to do in conventional cases. And that seems to be going on here, and we have to talk about what that means. Yes, Karina?
The only thing imperfect here is that, again, it's a good model, and obviously they're married at this point, but the child was also conceived out of wedlock. And I don't know whether or not that shifts something, even though we believe that life starts at birth, and if they were married at that point, but that doesn't seem to be an issue that's bothering this Gemara. The Gemara thinks this is a perfectly fine case to derive the laws of mourning from. Okay, so I have this Gemara, and I start thinking, this is really strange. Why are we deriving from the case of David and the case of Shmuel where, and remember, he explains, why did I get up, wash myself, anoint myself with oils, go to the Beit HaMikdash, have a feast? Because now there was nothing for me to do. Beforehand, I was trying to petition. And now, I'm not bothering with the morning stuff because there's nothing really to do. Okay.
Does that mean that Bathsheba was not required to mourn?
Well,
She has sexual relations with him when he gets up.
Well, we're going to talk about the timing in a minute. We'll get to the timing in a minute. Now, I was already blown away, and then I looked at the Yerushalmi on the same series of Mishnayim in the third parak of Moed Katan, which asks the broader question: what's the source for Shiva in general? Okay, our Gemara, the Bavli, the more conventional Gemara that we look to, says it's from Vahafachti Chagechem La'evel. That we will there's a verse which talks about transforming your holidays into times of sorrow, and since holidays are 7 days typically, except for Shavuos, what? Va'afachti Chagechem La'evel. Yeah.
Where is that from?
That is from the pasuk in Amos, Parachet pasuk Yud, cited in the Gemara in the Bavli Moed Katan on Chaf Amud Aleph. But the Yerushalmi has a remarkable passage here. We might go a little over time today. Okay. Here's the Yerushalmi. Minayin la'evel minatar. This is source 4. What is the biblical source for the rites of mourning for Shiva? Vayas la'aviv evel shivat yamim. So the first explanation is based on the mourning for Yaakov. The brothers mourned Yaakov 8 days. The Gemara says, wait a second, L'meidim davar kodem lamatan Torah. I didn't match up the English and Hebrew perfectly here, I'm sorry about that. Do we actually derive normative halacha from what the sons did for Yaakov before the Torah was given? Okay, so the Gemara seemingly rejects Yaakov and the mourning of his sons as a model for our Shiva. Pre-Matan Torah doesn't count. Rabbi Yaakov bar Acha b'shem Reb Ze'era shama la min Adam. Rabbi Yaakov bar Acha, the name Reb Ze'era, derives the rule from the following. This is wild. Upetach ol moed teshvu yomam v'layla shivat yamim ushmartem et mishmeret mishkan Hashem. At the door of the tent of the meeting you shall remain day and night for 7 days, performing what the Lord has charged, lest you die. Kishem sheshimer hakadosh baruch hu al olamo shiva, kach atem shimru al achechem shiva. Just as God kept watch over the world for 7 days, so too you must observe Shiva for 7 days for your brothers. What's the source that God sat Shiva for the world? That there was a 7-day delay until the flood waters were upon the world, which implies that God, as it were, sat Shiva for the world. The Gemara now points out the problem. Umit ablin kodem sheyamut hamet. Okay, so let's back up for a second. The Gemara rejects Yaakov's sons sitting Shiva for their father because it's before Matan Torah. The second suggestion the Gemara gives, the Yerushalmi gives, is from this instruction to Aaron and his sons to sit outside the tent of meeting for 7 days. When were they told to do that? What's that talking about?
When the sons died.
Right, so it's not when the sons died. What day is the inauguration of the Mizbeach? What parsha? What's the name of the parsha that Nadav and Avihu die in? Vayhi Bayom Hashmini. Right, they die on the 8th day. There were 7 days of Miluim. There were 7 days of preparation where the Mishkan was prepared for its official inauguration. Who did the work during that 7 days? Moshe. Moshe does the work, and Moshe is instructed by God to tell Aaron and his sons, you guys, you stay at the Petach Ol Moed for 7 days, day and night, and just sit there and guard the Mishkan while Moshe gets everything set up and ready to go. So the Yerushalmi is reading that as a source for Shiva. Who's Shiva? Nadav and Avihu's Shiva. What's the problem with that? They're not dead yet. You know who sat Shiva for Nadav and Avihu? Nadav and Avihu, before they died. Because according to the Yerushalmi, the source for Shiva is that Aaron and his 4 sons were commanded to sit and guard at the entrance of the Mishkan for 7 days, day and night, before the inauguration of the Mishkan. The inauguration of the Mishkan was also the day on which Nadav and Avihu died. And how do we know that that God was telling them to sit Shiva? Well, the Yerushalmi says, because God also sat Shiva. When did God sit Shiva? God sat Shiva for the world. When did God sit Shiva for the world? Not after he destroyed it, but in anticipation of destroying the world for 7 days. So we now have 3 sources in the Bavli and the Yerushalmi. There are other midrashim which back this up, which talk about Shiva and models of Shiva that we derive from Tanakh. And in each of the cases, the Shiva seems to be in anticipation or prior to the death. Now, in the case of Nadav and Avihu, they had no idea what was about to happen. So what does it mean that they sat there? Okay, so Moshe told them to sit there for 7 days. How does that count as Shiva? Why? The Gemara here seems to be taking seriously the idea that that's the source for 7 days of Shiva. Hashem waited 7 days until bringing the Mabul on the land. You know what those 7 days were? Those were 7 days of Shiva. Sometimes when we teach our kids drashot here, they're like, "Oh, come on, right? What's going on here?" Were we that desperate to find a source which has 7 days connected to death, so that we have to kind of cheat a little bit and go with all these instances where the death is after the 7-day period? Okay. The Yerushalmi even asked this question. That's where we left off. Umit ablin kodem sheyamut hamet? Is it really something that you can do to mourn prior to the death of the deceased? So the Yerushalmi says, Ela basar v'dam she'eni yodea ma atid liot einu mitabel ad sheyamut hamet. We don't know when somebody's going to die, so we can only mourn after their death. But Aval HaKadosh Baruch Hu, shehu yodea ma atid liot, shimer al olamot tchila. God sat Shiva because God knows when things are going to happen. So God could sit Shiva beforehand. Okay, but not David. But Aaron and Elazar and Itamar and David, what's going on here?
In the case of David, I think it can really be that there's a piece of him, it's a sign of his emunah. He believes that Hashem has said that this is going to happen soon. Maybe he doesn't know it's 7 days hence, but he knows it's going to happen. It's a sign of emunah. So at the same time that he's fighting with God, he's yielding to God.
Right. What's strange, though, is he's really trying to
Change.
undo it.
But
And
not without
it's
this
like these are all
belief that he's got to do all these things in front of Hashem.
right, but these are unwitting Shivas. That's what's
Fair enough.
strange about them.
Fair enough.
Nadav and Avihu and Aharon and his sons, they don't know.
They were commanded to do it. They did what they were told to do, not knowing that this was going to happen. HaKadosh Baruch Hu knew. They didn't know.
Okay, but here's what I would just say about that. Why then is that a model for us?
Oh, I have no idea.
It makes no sense. Like, why are we using these cases, which are all extraordinary or divinely mandated, or after the fact we can say, oh, now I get it, Vayhi Bayom HaShvi'i, David kind of sat, like, why is that relevant to our mourning?
Well, the question is, if it's supposed to be a period when you're being comforted, and you don't even know why you're sitting.
Good. So, like, we look at Shiva, and it's a time where people come and they talk and they offer, nobody said Hamakom to Aaron and his sons that week. Nobody said Hamakom to David that week. Nobody said Hamakom to Hashem the week that he was mourning, quote unquote, for the world. So we have something here that's the challenge here is we have to, on the one hand, these are extraordinary cases, but we have to somehow bridge the gap between these exceptional cases and the cases of conventional mourning that we're more familiar with. Otherwise, it makes no sense that the Gemara is trying to propose these as models. And so that's what we're going to try to do. The Rishonim really try hard to do it. I'm not going to read through everything. There's a long piece in the Ramban in his Torat Hadam, which we referenced when we were talking about Halacha Kedivrei HaMekel Ba'avel. And the Ramban has several explanations. I gave them little headings so that you can, did I give the headings to them?
Yes,
Yeah.
apparently.
Yeah. So the first answer that the Ramban gives is that in fact King David did observe Shiva after bearing his child, and he only had sexual relations with Bathsheba after the Shiva concluded. Prior to the burial of the child and the Shiva, before the onset of the mourning prohibitions, David bathed, changed his clothes, and went to worship in the temple. After that, he observed Shiva, and after that, he went and had sexual relations with Bathsheba. The problem with that is that the Pesukim don't sound like that at all. It sounds like David saying, I'm not mourning. It also sounds like there's not a week taking place. It's the myth. I call that the missing Shiva. It doesn't appear in the Pesukim that there was a Shiva observed, but the Ravid insists that there was a Shiva. Okay, that's number one. Obviously, very challenging. Number two, the Ravid suggests that David HaMelech did not observe Shiva for the deceased child, since the law does not mandate ritual mourning for a newborn whose viability is uncertain. A Natha. And so while the child was still alive, David assumed an intensive mode of behavior that simulated mourning rituals and praying for the child's life. But then it's become strange. If he didn't really have to sit Shiva, then why is this a model for us when it comes to our actual halachically mandated Shivas? So that the Ramban asks these questions, and then he offers his take on it in D. The Ramban says this is the royal Shiva. The king wouldn't debase himself while observing the mourning rituals, and that's why David HaMelech didn't observe Shiva, because he was the king. Now this is also very strange, because the whole point is they're telling him you're not acting like a king, and he says, I don't care what you say. And when Avshalom dies later on, David's inconsolable and doesn't act like a king. So I think what we suggested earlier is actually what the Gemara is getting at, and then we have to figure out what are the implications of it. And that is, that in fact, what these Gemaras are suggesting is that there are certain circumstances where we acknowledge that there is some kind of anticipatory avelut.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
So, Esther in the Megillah.
We have now had every single person have their phone go off. This is a
Mine-
miracle.
Mine's on silent. Somebody's phone.
So
All right.
what did you, Queen Esther,
Yes.
This is,
before she went in to see Ahasuerus, she
Right.
went through the rituals.
Right.
Which would remind us.
Right.
of
She did a
Avelut.
3-day fast. Right.
Right. So.
If things hadn't worked out, maybe that would have also been an
Right,
anticipatory
so I
avelut.
was gonna say, so I guess I'm thinking about that as a bakasha, and it's, as, the emunah, that, you want to express your bakasha in a way that you hope it'll be heard, and somehow the rituals related to avelut seem to be the way that one might be able to express that.
Right.
I'm not sure what the connection is exactly.
Right. So Tosot says similar to what you're saying, that David mourns because the prophet had told him the child's going to die. And so somehow David, simultaneously as he's praying for the child, is also engaged in mourning for the child. I don't love it because it doesn't ring true to the psukim. Yes, I think it's more after the fact Chazal view it through that lens. So let me try to reformulate this. If we carefully examine the psukim depicting David's behavior after his child's death, we infer that prior to the tragedy, David refrained from bathing, anointing, wearing fresh clothes, and having sexual relations. All classic markers of mourning. And the psukim explicitly state that he behaved this way until the 7th day. And although David's conscious motivation was to fast and implore God to change God's will, according to Chazal's penetrating reading of the psukim, David was actually, unwittingly, sitting shiva in advance for that child. The question is, what does that mean? So, I think in order to explain it, we have to understand what would make anticipatory avelut different. Why is it justified in these cases, and how do these cases then reflect on standard avelut? Remember, these are the sources for conventional avelut. Can we figure out a common denominator of these instances of anticipatory avelut? David before the death of his child, Hashem before the flood, Aaron and the sons before the death of Nadav and Avihu, that not only notices the advance warning of all these tragedies, but actually explains why a distinctive form of mourning is adopted in those specific situations. So I want to suggest that we can. And that this takes us back to some of the field of anticipatory grief. The primary distinguishing characteristic of this unusual construct of mourning, I think, concerns the mental state of the mourner, the perspective with which the mourner encounters the loss. The most immediate difference between classical avelut, and anticipatory avelut is whether the mourners look backwards or forwards. In classical avelut, the mourner is immersed in a week-long period of grief and reflection, looking back at the life of the deceased. In contrast, anticipatory avelut, the avelut takes place beforehand, because in each of these situations, it's not about looking backwards, it's about looking forward. It means focusing not on what was, but on what wasn't, what could have been, and what tragically will never be. Anticipatory avelut shares the characteristics of the anticipatory grief that we began with Eric Lindemann. What actually is let go in anticipatory mourning is not the actual person, but the hopes and dreams and expectations of a long-term future with that person and for that person. In anticipatory AVEILUT, the grieving process focuses on a vanished future that will never be realized. And that's what's so amazing. Anticipatory AVEILUT says that on rare occasions, we acknowledge this dimension of grieving. It insists that we have to grieve in this way. All of the occasions that Chazal identify as anticipatory AVEILUT share this sense of a lost future. And again, when you have terminally ill children, this is particularly, I think, meaningful. Given the age of the dying patient, much of the tragedy rests in the vanishing future that will never materialize. And I think in each of the cases, David's child and Nadav and Avihu and the world pre-flood, there's a certain sense of a lost future, a forward-looking element to it. I want to the untimely death of David's child, of Nadav and Avihu, and the antediluvian world require this kind of anticipatory AVEILUT. The death of David's child prevents the life of this child from taking shape, and Tanakh actually accentuates this by the fact that the child never gets a name, and that the next child is Shlomo, who has all this amazing future. Similarly, the great tragedy of the death of Nadav and Avihu is not only that they died, but that they died at that age before they were able to serve as the leading priests, etc. And likewise, the figurative mourning of God depicted in the Yerushalmi can also be understood in this manner. When Hashem mourns over the destruction of the earth, he's lamenting not what was lost, but the unfulfilled world of what could have been. So I want to try to kind of pinpoint what I mean by this and why this is so relevant, not just in these extraordinary circumstances, but in all cases of AVEILUT. But before we do that, I want to just share one other remarkable halachic text. That's the source number 7. Okay, this is really intense. Okay. Halachic sources recognize this painful dimension of an unrealized future. Okay, and here's one example of it. This is a source written by Rabbi Yom Tov Sahalom. He's known as the Maharitatz, a prominent 16th century rabbinic authority in Tzfat. He's forced to leave Tzfat because of a plague. And he goes together with his son, we don't know where the rest of the family is, and they wander around. But his son tragically contracts this plague and dies along the way. And the Maharitatz writes that he's going to suspend his regular course of study, which was Perek Ezehu Neshach, the 5th Perek of Bamitzia, dealing with the laws of interest. And he says, I'm going to start writing about the laws of mourning. So you don't find this in a conventional source. Here's the most heart-wrenching paragraph in the entire work. And it deals with the applicability of a halacha which we might be familiar with, but really personalizes it. There's a halacha called Lo Egel Arash. If you've ever been to a cemetery, people are always, very makbid to put their tzitzis away. You ever seen that? Yeah. Like if people wear their tzitzit out, they're supposed to tuck their tzitzit in. There's an idea of not mocking the dead, not saying, showing we're capable of fulfilling mitzvot while the dead are not. So it's a little bit of a strange concept to our modern mind. Like, why would they care? But there's a certain respect for the dead and their limitations to perform the mitzvot, their feelings, as it were. And so that's supposed to govern how we behave. You're not supposed to study Torah within, arba amot of a grave and the like. Okay, so listen to this paragraph. Od nistapakti. You can read the English on the other side. Masha asru zal litpalel b'toch dalet amot shel kever. What the rabbi said, you're not allowed to daven within 4 amos of a grave. Imu kever yeled katan, kamo b'ni tzadik, she'ein sham kever elahu. Im asr litpalel toch 4 amot tavolah. What about in my case? In the case of my child, my righteous minor child, where there's no other grave, you must have buried him along the way, and he's wondering, am I allowed to daven in the presence of my child's grave? Sorry for the rawness of this source. Mi amrinan zil batar tam. Let's go after the usual explanation of this law. My amar rabbana asulit bal mishum loy glarash cherefosei. So the reason why you're not allowed to daven within the close proximity of the grave is that that's seen as some kind of taunting of the deceased. Shenira kemaliga lamet shum mitpalel v'amet ein yochol litpalel. V'im kein haynu daf b'gadol sheyochol litpalel v'likrot b'Torah. So he says, my child was so young. They were never my son was never obligated in davening, so maybe there's no problem here. And maybe he wants to daven next to the grave of his child because that keeps him connected somehow. And so he says, maybe there's no problem here of Loy Glarash because my child was never actually obligated in davening, and so it's not like I'm davening and they're being prevented from davening because they're dead. It's because they were never obligated in the first place, so no problem. Or ואם כן היינו דווקא גדול שיוכל להתפלל ולקרוא בתורה, אבל קטנה אפילו כשהיה בחיים לא היה מתפלל ולא קורא בתורה, אם כן, לא שייך לא יגורש ויהיה מותר, או דילמה לא פלוג רבנן, דלא נתנו דבריהם לשיעורים. Maybe we say no, just across the board, you shouldn't daven within 4 amot of a grave. Whether it's an adult's grave or a child's grave, it doesn't make a difference. Okay, now listen to his answer. V'nir lomar da'asur. I can't daven next to them. I can't daven within 4 amot of my child's grave. But not because we just don't differentiate between adults and minors. Because in the case of a minor, it's even more of a problem. Because the whole idea of loe glarash, it applies to a katan as well, a minor as well. And it maybe is even more painful. Shiomar hakatan hinezel loe galai shelo higati lishnotav shi'ilu higati lishnotav hayiti korei v'shoneh mitpalel nimtza d'shayach tfei loe glarash. He says, you know what? The child, it's even more of a shtach, of a taunt, in the sense that this child, what could have been? This child could have had a lifetime of tefillah, of Torah, of mitzvot, and so we have to be even more careful, the Maharitat says, in these kinds of circumstances. So again, it's hard to leave aside. Setting aside for the moment the personal circumstances that he obviously is working through here, just the core insight, the idea that we recognize lost potential. We recognize halachically the idea that what could have been is something that we mourn and that we acknowledge and that we think about. That source, I think, says that more powerfully than any other source. And I think that's where the jump is possible. You follow me for a moment, right? We now understand that there's certain circumstances where the rabbis read biblical stories as cases of AVEILUT in anticipation. The parties themselves may not have known it, But when they were sitting Shiva, quote unquote, before the event transpired, they were mourning the lost future without the world, without the baby, without Nadav and Avihu. But Chazal say this is relevant for every single case of mourning that there is. Right? Here's what's so significant. Because in every instance of mourning, nearly every instance of mourning, there is an acute sense of what we mourn, what could have been. And I'll say that in our naming this and seeing that Chazal acknowledge it, that all cases of AVEILUT partake of this forward-looking element of anticipatory AVEILUT is I think very, very meaningful. And one of the things that we continue to deal with when thinking about my father-in-law is the milestones that will be missed, all of the celebrations that they won't be at. My daughter was the last couple of weeks was in probably the worst Riverdale Y musical in the history of musicals, James and the Giant Peach. It was terrible. I wanted to poke my eyes out. It was so bad. But
a really good Roald Dahl was in White Plains. I'm just telling you.
Okay, I've seen good Y shows. I've seen bad Y shows, and now I've seen
The worst.
the singular, most horrific one. But there's one person in this world who would have thought it was amazing.
That's right.
My father-in-law. He would have thought that Rayleigh was fantastic. He would have thought that she was great. And
I have news for you, even if we didn't know Rayleigh, a lot of us in the room watching, no matter how bad it was, we would have thought
Right.
every kid was fabulous.
Correct.
Just telling you.
every grandparent would think that. But out of our grandparents,
Yeah.
my parents and my mother-in-law, my father-in-law, my in-laws were much more of those. Like, my kids would say something at 6 months, and my father-in-law would decide, oh, that's proof they're a genius. You know? And my parents are a little bit more like me and Sherry, like they're just regular kids. So every single time there's a milestone, or even not even a milestone, any single time there's those kinds of events, we turn to ourselves and say, you know, the person who would have loved this the most wasn't here for it. And I think that's what this concept of an anticipatory AVEILUT is stressing, that there is in every single loss. You know, again, some people who live incredibly long lives and you know, have lots and lots of nachas and great grandkids, maybe that's a different circumstance. But anytime, there's always a sense of unfinished business, both for the person who passes away and for the family after the fact. And whether it's a young person dying, where that certainly is the case, or someone who you just feel like, you know, you wanted them to see, you know, all the bar and bat mitzvahs of their grandchildren. That's I think why Chazal feel like we can take this idea of anticipatory AVEILUT in the extreme cases of David, of Nadav and Avihu, and of the Mabul, and say that serves as a source for every AVEILUT. Because even though in most cases we don't, and we're not supposed to sit Shiva or even get into the details prior to the passing, that element of what anticipatory AVEILUT highlights, which is this idea that it's not about mourning the past, but it's about mourning the lost future, is a component of every single AVEILUT. And I think that that's what Chazal here are driving at. And we find even in the case of Moshe Rabbeinu, who dies after a full life of 120, the Gemara in Baba Batra describes how Moshe Rabbeinu was crying as he wrote the final words of the Torah. So is Moshe sad that he's dying? Yes, but it's not because he feels like he has regrets. It's because he's not going to be there for the next stage, for the next part of the journey of going into Israel and the like. I want to just conclude, because I am mindful of time, with one last source, which has a very unusual situation. Source number 10. The Tana de Eliyahu describes the passing of Adam Harishon in the following way: a highly unusual memorial ritual in the case of a fully lived life. מכאן אמרו ימי בחורותיו של אדם 120 שנה, אחר כך בא לעולם שמחה גדולה. אמרו יום שמת אדם הראשון עשוהו יום טוב, ועשו אותו יום משתה ושמחה. The scripture says that man's days shall be 120, implying that a person has 120 years in which he can serve as a vigorous agent of blessing. After this span, great joy enters the world. Indeed, the day that Adam was to die, they deemed it a holiday and celebrated it as a day of feasting and rejoicing. I think what this source is saying, and again, it's one source, that if someone lives a complete life, then the person themselves and others can look back at this complete, fulfilling life as a cause for celebration. The Medrash certainly stands out as anomalous in its joyful attitude towards death. And I would suggest that it's more aspirational. Were we only able to achieve the fulfillment of a complete life, we would have this. But I think it also serves as an inspiration for when we're thinking about loved ones who did live a full life, even if that full life was cut short. And I think bereavement frequently engenders a deep sense of unfinished business. And so we may not be able to immediately celebrate or even peacefully mark the completion of the life of the person who's passed away. And at times our immediate response is to intensively mourn over a future that never will be. And the rabbinic sources that we saw today acknowledge and even validate those feelings. But I think this last source also tells us that in classical AVEILUT, especially from the vantage point of the mourners, we do get the opportunity to look back. And that the aim of the AVEILUT process is that as the mourner begins to come to grips with the reluctant reality, he or she learns to accept the divine decree and cherish and even celebrate the rich life of the person that they love and that they sorely miss. And I think that's the last kind of comment that I want to kind of summarize these shiurim with. The laws of AVEILUT, I think, are ultimately extremely validating, whether it's talking about Kaddish and how Kadosh Baruch Hu mourns with us, or today in talking about how the rabbinic sources recognizing this sense of unfinished business. But it also helps guide us to a place where we can fully acknowledge that, but also use that sadness to appreciate the time that you had with the loved one, and to appreciate all the love and the values that they've transmitted to you. So for us and our family, kind of thinking about my father-in-law in those moments isn't grief-inducing. It's something that allows us to continue to remember him and appreciate him and miss him, but in a way that also affirms what a wonderful life he led and what he left for us and for his grandchildren. So I hope that as each one of us kind of navigates the experiences and circumstances that we find ourselves in, we're able to kind of, like Chazal were, to feel a sense of validation at the challenges that we have confronted, but also the message that sometimes the reason why it's so hard is because of how much that person meant to us and what they gave to us. That's it. Yes.
Many times we'll have funerals, and they get up and say,